Hello, my name is Anna, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Iceland. My research is focused on killer whale acoustics and the interspecific interactions between killer whales and pilot whales. In particular, I'm trying to understand the role that acoustic communication plays in the interaction between the two species. Underwater, vision is not very useful because often it's very dark or you just can't see very far. Sound, on the other hand, it travels very far and very fast underwater compared to air. So it's very useful to use sound underwater. And that's why a lot of whales and dolphins use sounds for all of their daily tasks, such as navigation or communication, to find food or to find mates. And so to do that, they produce a variety of different sounds. Killer whales, for example, they produce clicks for echolocation, so that's mostly to find food. And then they produce whistles and calls for communication. And so if we record these sounds, we can actually learn quite a lot about them. To record the sounds, we have a lot of different options or different methods. We use hydrophones these are underwater microphones, and you can just put them over the side of your boat and you can record whatever you hear underwater. But you can also put these hydrophones into the water for a very long time, which we call passive acoustic monitoring. You put them in the water for several months, and so you can get a very long-term picture. And then we also record sounds of the whales using tags, and these tags are attached to the whale with suction cups, because then the microphone is so close to the animal, you can get very high quality recordings. There were some studies done in the 1980s, and they had created a catalog, but it was quite small and it was based on a very few recordings. We had a few studies that were describing whistles and low frequency sounds and specific call types, but there wasn't really a big sort of overview of all the different calls that they make. The Icelandic Orca project had collected a lot of recordings already, so there was a lot of material to work with. The Icelandic killer whales, like most of the populations in the world, they have their own set of sounds that they make. So especially the calls, they're very stereotyped. So that means that you can easily group them into different categories. You can look at these different categories and you can compare them between populations. And from that, you can see whether different groups or different populations make the same sounds. Groups that are more closely related to each other will have more sounds in common than groups that are further related. Here in Iceland, we don't know quite so much, but from the catalog that we created, or we compared that to other locations in the North Atlantic, and we found that they produce sounds that are different from the ones in Norway, and mostly different from the ones in Scotland, but there was some overlap between sounds from Iceland and Scotland. Interesting in Icelandic killer whales is that they seem to have some sounds that are very specific or very different from other killer whales. There are, for example, low-frequency sounds that have not been recorded in any other population so far. It might be that we just haven't discovered them yet in other populations, or they just don't exist. But one of the most interesting sounds in Icelandic killer whales, I think, is the call type I-36, or the herding call. It's the only call type in killer whales that we could closely link to any behavior. So this call is quite different from other call types. It has very little frequency modulation, so it's a very flat sound. And it was recorded for the first time in the early 2000s in Iceland, in the Westman Islands. And the researchers back then quickly realized that it's closely related to feeding behavior. And when they started to look more at the detail of the sound, so they looked at the frequency of the sound, they found that actually the sound is not in the best hearing range of the killer whales, but it's in the best hearing range of the herring. They thought that the sound is actually not directed at other whales, but at the herring. The idea is that this sound kind of scares the herring and makes them bunch close together, so it's easier for the killer whales to feed on them. I think up to date we have classified 74 call types, but some of them have subtypes, so that means that they have slight variations in the sound that occur enough times that we say, okay, it's the same general call type, but a different subcategory. We continually discover new sounds. The sequence at which they produce the sounds is something that we looked at just recently. What we found is that repetitions of the same call type are very common, but they also produce specific combinations of sounds, and they are stringed together, and they have very specific patterns, and it seems almost like there are certain rules on which call types can be first and which call types can be last. It's very hard to say why they do this or why they combine these calls in a specific order. But of course, your first idea is that the combination of two sounds must have a different meaning than a single sound. The sequence call types, they are pretty cool. One of the ones that is part of that is the I11.4. And it's a nice one because it's very easy to recognize, and we have recorded it in many locations around Iceland, so it's very widespread. The story of pilot whales and killer whales is super interesting. First of all, pilot whales were not very common in Icelandic coastal waters until about 2014. So far, we only see them in the summertime in coastal waters in Iceland. But what is really interesting is that if they show up in these areas where killer whales hang out, the killer whales will avoid them. And sometimes they really run away from them at very high speed. This is very puzzling because we know that the killer whale is a top predator. So why do they avoid any other species? And also, why do the pilot whales approach them? Because all other whales and dolphin species that we know, they will avoid killer whales. There's different ways that we're trying to tackle this question. Well, the first step was that we looked at when do the two species occur and what actually happens in these interactions. And we looked at observations that we made from land, but also from the boat. So one of the big questions is like, what are the pilot whales feeding on when they are here? And the other question is, what triggers these interactions? We do think that sound plays an important role here because sound is very important for both of these species, and the pilot whales make a huge amount of noise when they approach the killer whales. The way that we are testing this at the moment is that we are playing the sounds of the pilot whales to the killer whales, and we record their response. In theory, this is very simple. You just go on your boat, you play some sounds, and then you watch or you see what the killer whales are doing. But in practice, of course, you have a few issues because you're trying to follow an animal that you cannot see most of the time, and it's moving in a three-dimensional space. So it's really hard to tell what the killer whales are doing. The way that we are trying to tackle this is by using tags on the killer whales with suction cups. These tags usually stay on for anything between 12 and 24 hours. Tags record the movement of the whale underwater. They record the depth that it dives to. They record the sound, and the newer tags also have video and GPS. So this really helps us to understand exactly and in detail how the killer whales respond when we are playing the pilot whale sounds. These experiments, we call them playback experiments. They're very time intensive. We had some good summer field seasons where we did 4 of these experiments in 1 month, which sounds very little, but was actually quite a lot. But then, of course, if the weather doesn't cooperate or the whales don't cooperate, then we get much less than that. We also need a lot of trained or well-trained people that know exactly what they're doing and that are willing to stay on a boat for 15 hours without going back to the harbor.